Antarctica is the great untamed continent, and it's no surprise that this extreme location fascinated H.P. Lovecraft. After all, for a body of work steeped in the insignificance of mankind, what better earthly setting is there than a landmass that no one has managed to permanently settle, despite our species' seeming ability to carve out a home almost anywhere? His fascination with it likely came from two sources, one being Edgar Allan Poe, which we'll get to in Part 3, and the then-current exploration of the continent. This aspect is important because of how Lovecraft approaches the work as the writings of a scientist, warning of why they must avoid going back to the frozen land we know so little about. We are reading an account written by the leader of an ill-fated expedition, Professor William Dyer, a geologist, made possible by a new drill invented by a fellow professor of Miskatonic University that would allow them to take even better samples than the previous expeditions. While this is notable, Dyer does not shirk on the details, using this to get into just about every aspect of what would be necessary for an expedition, to make clear that this is Lovecraft organizing the imaginary expedition that he would never lead. He probably wouldn't have even if some wealthy patron had offered to fund the whole thing. Lovecraft despised the cold, and indeed emphasizes the bitter chill atmosphere in a way that permeates the story. But the expedition is detailed. In addition to the new easily portable drill, there would be 4 airplanes for observational purposes, sled dog teams, and ever-moving camps with Dyer joined by Peabody, or Peabody depending on how you wish to pronounce it, who is the creator of this new drill. Also along is Lake of the biology department, and Atwood, a physicist with a knowledge of meteorology, joined by 9 mechanics to see to the equipment and 7 Miskatonic grad students, including Danforth, who plays a prominent role in their story. Their ship, the Arkham, would serve as a sort of a fallback base, complete with a 5th plane for potential rescue and responsible for conveying the expedition's regular reports back home for the public to appreciate. Dyer also explains the geological goals set for their expedition, again in detail, and then going into all the aspects of their fossil discoveries. The dense details might even make this rough reading for some, but it indicates Lovecraft's own fascination with it all, to dig into every possible scientific possibility that would be there and flesh out this expedition, rather than glossing over it as someone trying to write a persuasive letter might. This is not a criticism. Rather, it sets the stage for the technique that is employed. Dyer is a scientist, and so Lovecraft has him obsess over scientific details. Lovecraft was a heavy devotee of many of the sciences, especially chemistry, anthropology, and astronomy, something he poured himself into at a young age when he was forced to remain home due to childhood illnesses. So it's no surprise that he takes this opportunity to really get into the weeds here. It's not Herman Melville and his detailed whales, but it is a substantial portion of this early section and will occasionally crop up elsewhere. What interrupts things is the discovery of a pattern in the rock dating between 500 million and 1 billion years ago, and Lake's insistence on conducting an investigation into the area that it would have been going. Dyer feels that this is a pointless diversion, given how undeveloped life was at this time, with it highly unlikely to unearth anything interesting, especially given how much of this expedition's resources and personnel would be required for this endeavor. In the end, though, Dyer doesn't stand in the way, but he declines to personally participate, much to Lake's irritation, we gather, considering soon he would effectively mutiny and risk the expedition because of some promising leads. They quickly succeed at something stupendous, discovering a mountain range taller than the Himalayas, important even disregarding all of the scientific intentions. But over the course of their searching for the right rock strata, they discover a cave, filled with fossils dating from a period stretching over hundreds of millions of years. An incredible find. Both of these, however, pale compared to what he finds next. As they work soapstone, the dogs are getting worked up about something, but what it is would probably get most creatures worked up. It was a previously unknown specimen, a species that remained largely unchanged for hundreds of millions of years, but very large as opposed to the tiny critters you might expect. But what is truly remarkable is that Lake hasn't found a fossil, he's found intact specimens. realize the significance of what that would be. There's a reason that the way dinosaurs look has changed for a long time. It's because there are no even partially intact specimens around. But these are in good enough condition for Lake to be able to dissect when he gets back to camp, assuming the dogs don't rip the specimens to pieces along the way. 14 specimens are found, some damaged and some completely intact. Lake wastes no time in his difficult task of dissection because the specimens were so damn tough, and this was hardly what they had expected to discover. The creatures were completely alien, difficult to even fully classify as being animal despite having what is clearly an eye. But what was immensely creepy was the realization of how these creatures resembled the elder things or old ones mentioned in the Necronomicon. After all, it's one thing to find the city of Troy was real, it's another to be doing an autopsy on a centaur. So astonishing is this discovery that Dyer instructs the Arkham to tone down the message a little, out of fear that it's so hard to accept it will predispose people to assume that it's a joke or wishful thinking, rather than the truth. 2 years after this story was released was the famous story Who Goes There?, adapted into The Thing from Another World, as well as John Carpenter's The Thing. Well, as those films taught, finding something in the Antarctic and digging it out is a bad idea. Lake's camp falls silent, and Dyer is eventually forced to call in that emergency plane to pick him up and take him to the camp. Lovecraft does not rush there. He draws out the suspense, the search. Dyer seeing the mountains with his own eyes, seeing the cubes that indicate some kind of settlement within, which leads to such horrific thoughts to Dyer that he dubs them Mountains of Madness. On arrival, the explorers discover the entire camp is dead and send out word that they all perished due to weather. That's a massive lie. Oh, sure, the camp was indeed hit by horrible weather. There's signs of it all over that they weren't ready for this. But the weather doesn't explain why the damaged specimens of lakes were buried in the snow in identical mounds with special markings upon them, and all the rest were gone. One person was missing, Gedney, and it was speculated that he had gone insane and done all of this, though why is obviously unclear. The evidence suggests the dogs broke out of their enclosure. It was a makeshift setup created because of the extreme reaction to the specimens. But after that, they're unsure of what happened, only that the men and dogs died violently, either through horrific cuts or being choked to death. Afterwards, they were literally butchered, and they eventually conclude that there's no way that the missing man could have done all of this, but the alternatives are even worse. There's sign that a man and a dog were dissected, that someone was experimenting with some of the equipment, rifling through scientific journals, and the sledges were gone. Out loud they blame Gedney, but Dyer is sure that everyone's imagination was dreaming up the same unthinkable scenario. They use the plane to search the surrounding area, but there is no sign of anyone, or of the missing specimens. Thus Dyer decides the answer to what happened might be found in the mountains, only problem being that the dizzying height requires the lightest possible plane to reach safely, so only Danforth would accompany Dyer to the so-called Mountains of Madness. This point is emphasized to explain why what Dyer is saying is new, as it seems that Danforth was sworn to secrecy, and the evidence that they collected was kept under wraps, even developing the pictures themselves privately, so that none of the expedition knew what came. Dyer skips past it to his and Danforth's return, giving an explanation that satisfied the rest of the party, and telling of their return to the Arkham and eventually to Miskatonic, although Danforth has suffered a nervous breakdown. All this info allows Lovecraft to tease that what has happened so far is just a warm-up to the main event, that as bad as the camp is, what's to come is worse. He makes clear that it's so bad that even someone who is now hospitalized with mental issues is keeping his mouth shut about what he saw, because as Dyer explains, what they found isn't just horrifying, it could be the end of the world if anyone ever returned. What happened on that flight? We'll get into in part 2.